This is Back to the Bible, and we're glad you're here. God's will is so important, but sometimes it's not easy to understand. So today, Bryan Clark explains what it means to find and follow God's will. Later, he'll join Arnie Cole and Kara Whitney in studio to offer some practical take-home points. All right, let's join Bryan Clark for today's message.
It's not unusual that I'll engage people in a conversation related to God's will. People are trying to sort out, what is God's will for me and this and that. It's what we would refer to as the mysterious will of God. Now, that's a very legitimate discussion, and sometimes it's a very difficult thing to discern. But always in the midst of that discussion, I try to remind ourselves that there is what we call the mysterious will of God. That's what you're searching for. But there's also what we refer to as the revealed will of God, which means God's already made statements in His Word. This is my will. And it's very important when you're discerning the will of God to first ask yourself the question, am I already being obedient to the revealed will of God? In essence, if I'm not willing to obey what I already know is the will of God, why would God reveal more of His will to us? So that's what we want to talk about, what I would refer to as the revealed will of God. If you have a Bible, turn with us to 1 Peter chapter 2. We're working our way through 1 Peter. Last week, we reminded ourselves that we are living stones being built up to a spiritual house. We are a royal priesthood. We're a chosen race. We're a holy nation, once not the people of God, but now by the grace and mercy of God, we are the people of God. So then, how do we live that way? How do we live as the people of God in a culture of despair? So that's where we pick it up in verse 11. Beloved, I urge you as aliens and strangers to abstain from fleshly lusts, which wage war against the soul. 8 times in Peter's epistle, 1st and 2nd Peter, he reminds them that he deeply loves them, that these are people he deeply cares about and has significant concerns for them. As aliens and strangers, again, this is how he introduced them in the very first part of chapter 1, that as aliens, they are citizens of one country but living in a different country. In this case, most of them are Jewish. They have been driven out of Palestine because of persecution. They're living in Asia Minor, northern Turkey. And as such, they have very few rights or protections. So part of this is just trying to be skillful in living to stay alive. There's a fair amount of persecution. They're under Nero as the emperor. This is about to get much worse. So it'd kind of be like a Christian in maybe one of the Middle Eastern countries today. They need to be very thoughtful and skillful because their very lives are at stake. The idea of strangers carries more the idea of being kind of wanderers, being pilgrims. They just kind of move from place to place. They're transient. Both words were used to describe Abraham and his family en route to the promised land. It's probably why Peter uses the terminology here. But of course, it's metaphoric in the sense that we are citizens of heaven, living out that citizenship on earth, and we need to live it out in a skillful way. So he urges them, he pleads with them to abstain from fleshly lusts. Now, he already brought this up in chapter 1. He talked about at one time there were behaviors that defined our lives simply because we were ignorant, because we were in darkness, because we didn't know any better. Isn't necessarily referring to things that are evil so much as it is all of us have natural longings and desires. It's kind of the outflow of being made as people in the image of God. But when God isn't in the picture, we desperately seek to satisfy those desires in ways that are contrary to the plan of God. As it says in the Proverbs, there is a way that seems right, but the end is devastating. So we try to satisfy those longings and desires in all kinds of ways that ultimately are empty and futile and destructive. Now that makes some degree of sense when we were ignorant, when we were in darkness. But now that we are in the light, now that we know better, then it would be very unwise to go back to those same behaviors. Since this is the second time that Peter has brought this up, there must be some sense that the people are returning back to some of their destructive ways, and he's pleading with them to reconsider that. He says the issue then is that those fleshly lusts wage war against their soul. Peter uses the word soul in the sense of the whole person, the intellect, the emotions, the will. It's not specifically that part of us that connects with God, but kind of my whole person. Basically, the summary of what Peter is saying is it's going to be hard enough to live out the value system as the people of God on earth without self-destructing, without waging war against yourself. Why make it that much more difficult by making such poor choices? So that's kind of like step one. This is going to be hard enough without self-inflicted wounds. One other thing about verse 11 that I think is worth noting is the idea of fleshly lusts. Some of your translations have natural desires. That actually is an excellent translation in this context because that is what it's talking about. And that's very important to see that Peter is saying abstain from those desires that come naturally because they wage war against your soul. Because as a culture today, we're very confused about this. As a matter of fact, it saddens me that so many Christians have been persuaded by this argument. The idea is if something is a natural desire, then that must make it morally right. As a matter of fact, some people even push it that if something is a natural desire, then that's obviously the way God created me. Therefore, he would want me to pursue that desire. Peter couldn't be more clear. Abstain from natural desires because they wage war against our souls. If you read Paul's argument in Romans chapter 1, basically what he says is because we have exchanged the glory of God for the glory of a creature, we have in essence decided to worship the creature rather than the creator. It has made a mess of our natural desires. Paul in essence says this is going to confuse and mess up what we naturally desire, which ultimately is a road of destruction unless we listen to what God has to say. So it's really important to understand morality, right and wrong, cannot be defined by just what I naturally desire. It has to be defined on God's word and what God says is right and wrong.
You're listening to Back to the Bible. If you'd like to listen again, visit backtothebible.org. That's backtothebible.org. Our study continues now in 1 Peter chapter 2. Here again is Bryan Clark.
Verse 11 is what not to do. The discussion then moves, verse 12, what we are to do. Keep your behavior excellent among the Gentiles, so that in the thing in which they slander you as evildoers, they may, because of your good deeds, as they observe them, glorify God in the day of visitation. So we are to keep our behavior. The word excellent probably isn't the best translation there. The idea is winsome or attractive. It's the very same message we saw in Proverbs, that we should, when we obey God, we actually make the message of the gospel attractive to people that are seeking and searching. So keep your behavior attractive or winsome to the Gentiles, which is a reference to the unbelievers. Peter's using kind of old covenant language that if we as believers are the people of God, everybody outside of that are the Gentiles. It's not an ethnic reference, it's a spiritual reference. So that in the thing in which they slander you, they may actually, because of your good deeds, ultimately come to Christ. When it says the day of visitation, it is possible to take that as the day of judgment. But almost all scholars believe in this context it's a reference to their day of salvation. The term is often used that way and makes the most sense here. That's how they glorify God, by ultimately coming into a relationship with Christ. Now, how do you turn a slanderer into a child of God? It's not by words, it's not by social media, it's not by blogging, it's not by winning an argument. It's by engaging in behavior around something that they themselves would say matters, in order that by our good behavior, at least some of them will come into a relationship with Christ. Nobody likes to be slandered. Nobody likes to be called names. It's very common in our culture that the unbelieving world slanders Christians. That should not surprise us. The word devil actually means slander. We should expect that. Doesn't mean we like it. But the question is, how do we turn a slanderer into a child of God? Answer is by doing good, by engaging in behaviors that matter to them. I've said before, it's very hard to hate someone that you're sharing a cup of coffee with. There's something about that changes the relationship. It's equally true that it's hard to continue to slander someone who has actually rolled up his or her sleeves and is engaging in something that you deeply care about. That's in essence what Peter is saying. So then the question arises, well, what exactly are we talking about when we say good behavior? So he goes on then and talks about good behavior as a citizen, good behavior as a slave or a master, good behavior as a husband or wife, and these are all things that we're going to look at in the next several weeks. We're going to start with a very non-controversial, easy discussion, and that is submitting to the government. So we pick it up in verse 13. Trust me, it doesn't get easier. Submit yourselves, for the Lord's sake, to every human institution, whether to a king as one in authority, or to governors as sent by him, for the punishment of evildoers and the praise of those who do right. So the first discussion is, what does it look like to be a good citizen as part of our witness as the people of God? Now, first of all, for some reason, we as a culture have kind of this reaction anytime we see the word submit. And yet we have to recognize we submit in dozens of ways every day. Anybody that runs a business asks his or her employees to submit. Anybody in the healthcare system, anybody in the school system, anybody in government, you can't function without some level of submission. There's an authority structure, whether it's a family or a business or a government, that is necessary to avoid chaos in order to be effective. The word is actually a military term, and it literally means to arrange under. So it's helpful to think of it that way. It's necessary in the military, it's necessary in business, it's necessary in a church, it's necessary in a family, it's necessary within the structures of government. So submit yourselves for the Lord's sake. Basically, what he's saying there is a consistent biblical message, and that is government is established by God. There is this reality that because we are sinners and our natural bent is towards selfishness and sin, that even a bad government is better than no government. History is abundantly clear on this, that when there is lawlessness, when there is no government in charge, it does not turn into a utopia. It turns into the law of the jungle. It is a bloodbath, and everyone loses. So even in countries where there is a bad government, there is at least an authority structure that allows people to live some sort of a predictable lifestyle. Certainly a good government's better than a bad government. We also understand there are dramatic differences between a first century Roman government and a 21st century American government. This was under the time of Nero. So it's probably helpful not to start down the path of, yeah, but you don't know how bad our government is. Trust me, compared to the first century Roman Empire, what we have is absolutely delightful. These were people under the bloody, immoral abuse of Rome. Nero would be the one who would ultimately execute Paul. He's the one who shortly after Peter's letter would execute Peter. He's the one who would up the persecution dramatically. Yet there is an understanding, if these people are going to survive and have a life, they need to be skillful as citizens. In their case, kind of fly under the radar. In our case today, we understand it's very different from that. As a matter of fact, for all the complaints and frustrations we have with government, it's worth stopping and reminding ourselves that we as Americans live with a level of peace and prosperity and freedom that probably no people in the history of the world have ever known. And before we complain too much as the church, there is no question that we as the church in 21st century America have more freedom to accomplish our mission than any church has had in the history of Christianity. One day when we stand before God, the one thing we will not be able to say is that we failed in our mission because the government wouldn't allow us to do our job. So for all the kind of frustration and complaining, let's not forget that what we have is really quite remarkable. But it is true, there's differences in we have avenues to make changes and to voice our opinion and to have elections and all of that. But it's also probably good to remind ourselves what we mean when we talk about civil disobedience. It seems that there are many people today, including many Christians, who are under the impression that we have the right to civil disobedience anytime we disagree with policies or decisions that are made by the government. It's important to understand that is not what Peter is saying. He's saying actually just the opposite, that we need to respect the fact that government is in place by God. And as the people of God, for the Lord's sake, we submit to that. It means that we respect that we value that we operate as good citizens within the system. Civil disobedience is restricted for those moments when the government requires us as Christians to do something that is immoral or offensive in the eyes of God. At that point, we have to choose faithfulness to God over faithfulness to the government. But it is not an excuse to do as we please and disrespect those in authority every time there's some sort of a decision or policy that is contrary to your opinion.
Now Bryan Clark joins us in the studio with Back to the Bible CEO Arnie Cole and author Kara Whitney.
Bryan, I hear what you're saying. We have to respect the government. But if you're involved, you're in for a great big huge fight. And a lot of times the guys you see that claim to be Christ followers, down the road you find out, oh, that was just a political stand as well. So how do we understand God's will in all of this?
Well, it is complicated, and I think a lot of people are frustrated by it. So a good starting place is context. So the first readers were in a very abusive Roman government under Nero. So it's helpful to think not everyone that's ever read these texts is an American. But then I think also separating out government from politics, because government's huge. And all of our churches have people that serve in government roles, and they do it quietly and faithfully and do a great job, and we need Christians there. Politics is what frustrates people, and I think those that get into it that are Christ followers can't fight fire with fire. They just can't, or they compromise their witness. But I also think it's helpful to remember, in America, in our context, the government really is the people. And again, if we change the culture, then it would change the government. I don't think it works the other way around. I don't think you change the government to change the culture. So whose job is it to be an agent of change in the culture? What's the church's job? So we have freedom to do it. We have really no restrictions. So if we're frustrated with the government, then let's do our job, change the people will change the government.
Thanks for taking time to be with us today. If you'd like to listen to this message again, please visit us at backtothebible.org. That's backtothebible.org. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more of Bryan Clark's teaching, right here on Back to the Bible.